All right, so this is a bit of a rambling post about this French orchard area in front of the house. Um, so it starts off, I guess, about 23 years ago when we bought this land. And when you're homesteading, if you've ever read any books on it or read any histories of people doing it, one of the first things they always do is they plant their fruit and nut trees before the garden, before the house, right up there with the very first, infrastructure of the area, like to get a vehicle in, so some kind of road, maybe an outhouse, and then some kind of lean-to that you can live in for the summer. You should be planting your fruit trees. And this is because once you start homesteading, once you start clearing the land and you start planting gardens and having animals and all these things and maybe having kids and all these other things, then the fruit tree thing might slip further and further into those years. You might not get around to it for 4 or 5 years, actually planting trees. And then the trees themselves take 4 years or 10 years or whatever to grow to produce. So then you've been there 15 years before you're actually getting fruit and nuts and such. So the idea is to do it right off. So then by the time you're kind of ready for processing and kind of more entrenched in the land, after a few years, then the trees start to bear. But the problem with this, of course, is that you don't know anything when you first starting to homestead, or you probably know very little. So this is a story of aspirations and failures, because I knew this was kind of a deer yard, which is to say this is where the deer come in the winter and they eat back everything. So I was like, okay, if I'm planting apple trees, they should be in close to the house. And so the closest, most open place where there's never any vehicles and there wouldn't be any fields was right here, right in front of the house. And so I dug up a bunch of old apple trees, sprouts from somebody's compost, a cider maker. So he's got tons and tons of sprouts around the compost every year. You can dig them up. It's pretty random what they're going to be because his cider's all made from wild apples and all such. So anyways, collected up those young sprouts and I planted 6 apple trees. Now pretty quickly into my years here, maybe by the 2nd or 3rd year, I had gleaned a new, very important and relevant piece of information, which is you never plant fruit trees where their feet are wet, which is to say, for a good part of the year, the land needs to have complete drainage. The roots can't sit in a kind of a subsoil slurry, like a watery area. Well, Lou's coming over to say hello. There she goes. That's what that noise is, crashing through the bush. So anyways, so I made a mistake. This whole area is very low-lying, which is excellent for the garden, because things like beets and cabbages and things that put down deep roots have moisture to pull from without having to water. So fantastic for the garden, which is all behind us here. But on this side where the orchard is, verging on disaster, basically. So what happens is the trees will grow very quickly because there's moisture and nutrients. They'll produce tons of suckers, way more than would normally be the case, because they're called water suckers. And because they're tapped into that, they produce tons of suckers. They'll flower eventually, but very little fruit, and usually pretty diseased and mealy and stuff, again because of the water thing. So there's a couple other stories I could insert here, but just to continue on with the kind of lesson at hand, uh, let's just say maybe about 10 years have passed, and the trees are quite big, and I've more or less kept them pruned up so that they don't get super diseased or anything and start, diseasing other trees that are in better spots that are actually productive here. But not much has happened. So, in that same time period, these Manitoba maples that were here when I arrived have been reproducing. And Manitoba maples grow up, they reach for the light, they become imbalanced, they crack, they fall over, but they do not die. They continue to grow and shoot up from there, and shoot up from there, and shoot up from there. This is a disastrous tree for the eastern forest. It's exactly antithetical to a climax old growth forest. It's kind of working it backwards by hobbling all the other trees and bending them over and making a mess. So there's a lot in here about the Manitoba maples. We also kept them because the females that bear the keys feed like grosbeaks and tons of other birds around here. So we get flocks of birds coming here because of the Manitoba maples all winter and all season, really, and it's really a beautiful thing. But just to say, in the 12 years of kind of watching them, I realized that they're not good for the hedgerows and the forests here, and I'll keep some that were already here, the big ones, but for the most part I'm trying to kind of eliminate them now. They're extremely fibrous, so they're terrible for splitting, and they're a softwood, so you don't get much heat from them. I have a lot of other wood around, kind of better selections, even like elm that are all dead, which are hard to split, but if you cut them when they're small, they're good. So this Manitoba maple, I wasn't really too sure what to do with it over the years. I have been burning it and stuff like that. So then along comes a couple things that happen. One was I had this realization in this meditation on Manitoba maple that as a tree, their whole purpose is to grow out in the flatlands, in the prairies where the rivers meander over the decades. And you need trees that can adapt to the shifting land and kind of fall in and root and fall in and root. And so for that kind of ecology, they're perfectly evolved, but for this ecology, they're not. So anyways, this was part of the realization that made me kind of decide to start to cut them out. All right. So on to the next part of the thing. In this interim time, this is about 10 years ago or something, this Hügelkultur became very popular. And I know many people who have kind of tried it, and it works at a certain point. Once you can get enough moisture in there for long enough and the wood starts to decay, it definitely works. The wood feeds the vegetables, feeds the vegetative matter. The wood becomes the compost. So with these two pieces in mind about the kind of nature of the Manitoba maples being unsuited for the land here, and this wood thing, and this area being too low and wet, the bulb kind of finally goes off. So what I've done here to generate this abundance, because there was none of this going on behind me in previous 16 years or so. Anyways, about 5 years ago, I started just cutting the Manitoba maples up and laying them in like a stack of wood side by side, but just one layer, right? So you're kind of creating a mulched area around the drip line of the tree, ideally. And then, to a certain degree, I'm kind of letting that grow over, cutting grass and scything around here and putting that on top of it so that the Manitoba logs stay moist from underneath, little layer of vegetation on top. And within 2 or 3 years, they rot and they feed the tree in this incredibly balanced way. So this is one of the things, like when I first realized my mistake, I was like, well, I could bring in a giant ring of compost around the tree, like maybe 2 or 3 square meters per tree, to raise the land so there's enough root mass above where the soaking area is that they'll produce. And then I thought, that's ridiculous. I'm never going to do that, because to generate that much compost or to buy it, it just wouldn't be worth it. But this thing with the logs has done exactly that. It's just slowly raising the ground. So there's one tree I've done it with twice, like I did it 5-6 years ago, and then I did it 2 years ago. You still can't see any logs. I'm going to get a bunch of shots around here to just kind of catch the remnants of logs that I put here. I think it was just last year, but maybe it was 2 years ago, and they're basically gone. And the tree is clearly feeding on them. All these ferns are growing in around the logs. This is pretty hard to see, but log decided log here. So they're packed in more or less side by side as close as you can get them. And again, 3 or 5 years, they're completely gone, and most of that time they're feeding the tree. So a kind of story there about a dream, and then the failed hope, like the lost dream, and then some kind of miraculous, reconfirmation of the original intention to have the trees here in the front of the house. So I just want to share that kind of, that long winding story.